The words hung in the air like an accusation waiting to be answered. Congressman Schiff, you've said publicly, repeatedly, for over 2 years, that you had more than circumstantial evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. I'm asking you now, under oath, where is it? Dan Bongino's voice wasn't raised. He didn't need to shout. Every syllable carried the weight of years. Years of watching, years of documenting, years of waiting for this exact moment. This wasn't theater. This wasn't performance. This was the reckoning. The House Judiciary Committee hearing room felt smaller than it was. The cameras positioned around the perimeter seemed to lean in, as if they too understood the significance of what was unfolding. Reporters in the back row stopped their frantic typing. The usual whispered conversations between staffers ceased entirely. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet itself, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Representative Adam Schiff sat at the witness table, his hands folded in front of him with practiced precision. His expression, that familiar look of grave, almost sorrowful concern, was already settling into place like a mask he'd worn so many times it had become comfortable. He'd been summoned to testify before the new Republican majority, called to answer questions about FBI misconduct, about the weaponization of federal agencies, about the lies that had consumed American politics for years. And sitting across from him, not as a congressman, not as a pundit, but as an expert witness with the credentials to back every word he spoke, was Dan Bongino, former NYPD officer, former Secret Service agent, a man who'd spent his career inside the very institutions that had been corrupted, who knew how they worked, who knew what they were capable of, and who had watched them get weaponized for partisan purposes. This wasn't going to be another cable news hit where Schiff could deploy his standard deflections. No carefully crafted sound bites about ongoing investigations. No vague references to classified information that supposedly justified everything but could never be revealed. This was under oath, on the record, with nowhere to hide. Bongino sat perfectly still, waiting. He wasn't fidgeting with papers. He wasn't checking notes. He was simply watching Schiff with the patient, knowing gaze of someone who had all the time in the world and knew exactly how this was going to end. "Mr. Bongino," Schiff began, his voice measured and calm, the voice of a man who'd been through thousands of contentious moments and believed he could navigate this one too. The Mueller investigation detailed numerous contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian operatives. The evidence. "That's not what I asked you, Congressman." The interruption was surgical. Bongino's tone hadn't changed, it was still level, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Not anger, not aggression, something harder to defend against: certainty. "I asked you about your claim, your specific claim." Bongino leaned forward slightly, not in a threatening way, but in the way someone does when they're about to say something they've been waiting years to say. "On March 22, 2017, you went on Meet the Press with Chuck Todd. You said, and I'm quoting here, 'I think there is more than circumstantial evidence now.' You didn't say you suspected something. You didn't say you were concerned about potential contacts. You said you had seen evidence of collusion. Not meetings, not conversations. Collusion, criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia." Bongino reached for a tablet that sat on the table in front of him. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He pressed play. Schiff's own voice filled the hearing room, younger but unmistakable. "I think there is more than circumstantial evidence now that the Russians have compromised the President of the United States." The clip ended. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was damning. "That was you, correct?" Bongino asked, though they both knew the answer. Schiff's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The context of that statement." "I don't care about context right now, Congressman." Bongino's voice remained steady, but there was steel in it now. "I care about the claim. You said you had evidence. Robert Mueller spent 2 years investigating. $40 million, 500 witnesses, 2,500 subpoenas, an entire team of prosecutors who wanted nothing more than to find something, anything, that would prove collusion. And you know what they found?" He paused, letting the question sit. "Nothing. Zero. No evidence of collusion. No criminal conspiracy. No coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. The Durham report, which came later and which you also ignored, confirmed the whole thing was built on a foundation of lies from the beginning. Bongino placed the tablet back on the table with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than it should have. So I'm asking you again, Congressman, where is your evidence? Schiff straightened in his chair, and for a moment it looked like he might try a different approach. The Intelligence Committee received classified briefings that have since been declassified, Bongino finished for him. He reached down and lifted a thick folder, letting it land on the table with a thud that echoed through the room. I've read them, Congressman, all of them. Every single classified briefing your committee received during that time period. I've read every memo, every intelligence assessment, every piece of so-called evidence that was presented to you. He opened the folder, though he didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He'd memorized every word. There's nothing in there. No evidence of collusion, no smoking gun, no secret intelligence that somehow eluded Robert Mueller's entire team of investigators. Nothing. Bongino looked up, his eyes never leaving Schiff's face. So either you lied about having evidence, or you're sitting on evidence that somehow escaped the attention of Mueller, the FBI, the CIA, and every investigative body that looked into this. Which is it? The Republican members of the committee were leaning forward now, sensing something shifting in the room. This wasn't the usual partisan bickering where both sides talked past each other in prepared talking points. This was something different. This was accountability happening in real time. The Democratic members looked less comfortable. They were shuffling papers, exchanging glances, trying to figure out how to protect Schiff without making things worse. But they knew, everyone in that room knew, what was coming. They'd seen the documents. They'd read the reports. They knew Schiff couldn't answer the question. The investigation was warranted based on the information available at the time. Schiff tried, pivoting to the familiar defense that had worked for years. Stop it. Bongino held up one hand, and the single word carried more authority than a shouted objection. That's a different claim, Congressman. Now you're defending the investigation itself. I'm not asking about whether the investigation was warranted. I'm asking about your specific claim to have evidence. You went on television not once, not twice, but dozens of times over 2 years and told the American people that you had seen evidence of collusion. CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, PBS, you were everywhere. I've seen evidence, you said. More than circumstantial, you said. Bongino pulled out a printed spreadsheet, each line meticulously documented. The pages seemed to go on forever. I have here a list of 43 separate television appearances where you made explicit claims about having evidence of collusion. 43. I have the dates. I have the transcripts. I have the video clips. He looked up. And now, after Mueller found nothing, after Durham exposed the whole thing as a political operation built on fabricated evidence and FBI misconduct, you want to talk about whether the investigation was warranted. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his hands in a gesture that was almost conversational. Congressman, I'm a simple guy. I was a cop in New York. I protected presidents for the Secret Service. Republican and Democrat didn't matter to me because that wasn't my job. My job was to protect the office. I know how investigations work. I know how evidence works. I know the difference between suspicion and proof, between correlation and causation, between contacts and conspiracy. His voice dropped lower, more personal. And here's what I know. When you tell the American people, not as a pundit, not as a talking head, but as the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, when you tell them that you have evidence that the President of the United States is compromised by a foreign power, you better actually have that evidence. Because that's not just politics, Congressman. That's not just partisan messaging. That's an accusation of treason. That's calling the President a traitor. The weight of those words settled over the room. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I'd like a direct answer. Where is the evidence you claim to have seen? Schiff's jaw was tight now, the mask of concern slipping just slightly. You could see him calculating, trying to find the exit, the deflection that would work. But Bongino had closed every door. I stand by my statements at the time, based on the information that was. So you're saying the evidence existed then but doesn't exist now? Bongino pressed forward without mercy. Or you're saying you never actually had evidence but claimed you did anyway? Because those are the only two options here, Congressman. Either you had evidence and it mysteriously disappeared, which would be remarkable and worth investigating, or you lied. Which is it? The hearing room erupted in murmurs. Reporters in the back were typing frantically, knowing this was already going viral, that this moment would be clipped and shared millions of times before the day was over. This was the confrontation that half of America had been waiting for and the other half had been dreading. I acted in good faith based on intelligence assessments available to the committee. Schiff tried again, his voice strained now, the composure cracking at the edges. Good faith. Bongino repeated the words slowly, as if tasting them, testing them. His voice rose slightly, the first crack in his controlled demeanor, the first hint of the anger that had been building for years. Congressman, do you know what happened because of these claims? Do you have any idea what your good faith accusations did to people's lives? He didn't wait for an answer. I do. I know because I still talk to people in these agencies. I still have friends who work there, who dedicated their lives to serving their country, and who watched their institutions get corrupted. Careers were destroyed, Congressman. Reputations were ruined. General Michael Flynn, a decorated military veteran who served his country for decades, was bankrupted and prosecuted for a process crime that had nothing to do with Russia. Carter Page, an American citizen who actually helped the CIA, who worked with our intelligence agencies, was surveilled for years based on lies. Based on a warrant application that omitted exculpatory evidence and misrepresented facts to a federal judge. Bongino's voice grew harder. Lives were torn apart. Families were destroyed. People lost their jobs, their savings, their futures. And through it all, you went on TV night after night, appearance after appearance, telling America that you had evidence. You gave credibility to the whole thing. You made people believe their suspicions were justified. You made them believe their president was a traitor. He paused, visibly collecting himself, reining in the emotion. And it was all based on nothing. Worse than nothing, it was based on lies. Lies that you either knew were lies or were too incompetent to recognize as lies. So which is it, Congressman? Were you lying or were you just that bad at your job? I resent the accusation, Schiff began, his voice finally showing real anger. I don't care what you resent. Bongino's response was flat, final. I care about the truth, and the truth is that you spent 2 years telling America you had evidence you didn't have. The truth is that you used your position, your chairmanship of the Intelligence Committee, your security clearance, your access to classified information, to give credibility to a hoax. The truth is that you never apologized. You never retracted. You never showed even a hint of remorse for the damage you caused. You never acknowledged that you were wrong. He leaned forward again. And now you're sitting here, under oath, and you still won't give a straight answer. The Republican chairman, who had been letting Bongino run with the questioning, leaned into his microphone. His voice was formal, procedural, but there was satisfaction underneath it. The witness will answer the question. Congressman Schiff, do you have evidence of Trump-Russia collusion that was not included in the Mueller report? Yes or no? Every eye in the room fixed on Schiff. The cameras zoomed in. This was the moment. After years of claims, years of accusations, years of congressional hearings and media appearances, and fundraising emails based on the Russian collusion narrative, this was the moment of truth. Schiff was trapped. He couldn't invoke classified information because it had been declassified. He couldn't claim ongoing investigation because it was over. Mueller had finished. Durham had finished. The FBI's investigation had concluded. There were no more rocks to hide under. He had nowhere to go. The Mueller report detailed, he began. The Mueller report, Bongino interrupted, his patience finally exhausted, found no evidence of collusion. Page 2, Volume 1. I have it right here. He pulled out a copy, worn from use, tabs marking specific pages. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. He read it slowly, emphasizing each word. That's Mueller's conclusion, Congressman, not mine, not some partisan hack's interpretation. Robert Mueller himself, The man you praised as a dedicated public servant, the man you said we should all trust, the man who led the investigation you claimed would vindicate everything you'd been saying. He found nothing. Bongino set the report down and pulled out another document. But you know what? Let's talk about how this whole thing started. Let's talk about the foundation of your so-called evidence. Let's talk about the Steele dossier. He saw it, the slight change in Schiff's expression, the micro-movement that suggested fear. This was the part Schiff definitely didn't want to discuss. The foundation. The origin story of the Russia collusion narrative that had consumed American politics for years. The Steele dossier, Bongino continued, his voice taking on a lecturing quality now, like a prosecutor laying out a case piece by piece, was opposition research paid for by the Clinton campaign and the DNC through a law firm called Perkins Coie, which hired a company called Fusion GPS, which hired a former British intelligence officer named Christopher Steele. That's not conspiracy theory, Congressman. That's established fact. It's in the public record. The DNC and Clinton campaign admitted it after initially denying it. He paused, making sure everyone was following. Christopher Steele was hired to dig up dirt on Trump, and he produced a dossier, a collection of memos full of salacious, unverified allegations. Allegations about prostitutes in Moscow hotels. Allegations about secret meetings. Allegations about a vast conspiracy between Trump and the Kremlin. All of it sensational. None of it verified. None of it true. Bongino leaned forward again, his voice dropping to something more dangerous. But here's the key thing, Congressman. The thing you never told the American people when you went on television to talk about your evidence. You knew it was opposition research. The FBI knew it was opposition research. It was disclosed to the FBI in the summer of 2016 that this dossier was funded by Trump's political opponents. And yet, when you went on television to talk about evidence of collusion, you never mentioned that your evidence came from a document paid for by Hillary Clinton's campaign. Why not? The Steele dossier was one piece of many sources of information, Schiff said, trying to regain his footing. It was the primary piece, Bongino corrected immediately. The FBI used it as the foundational evidence to obtain FISA warrants to surveil Carter Page. And through Carter Page, because of the way FISA works, the two-hop rule, they could surveil basically everyone in his network, which included people in the Trump campaign. The dossier wasn't just one piece. It was the cornerstone. It was the justification. Without it, there was no surveillance warrant. Without the surveillance warrant, there was no investigation into the campaign. The dossier was everything. He pulled out more documents, each one more damning than the last. And you knew it was Clinton opposition research. You knew it wasn't verified intelligence from friendly foreign services. You knew it was political dirt commissioned by Trump's opponent in an election. And you never told anyone. Bongino's voice grew colder. In fact, let's talk about what else you knew. In January 2017, before you started making your public claims about evidence, the FBI interviewed Igor Danchenko, the primary subsource for the Steele dossier, the guy who provided most of the information to Steele. You know what Danchenko told the FBI? He didn't wait for an answer because he knew Schiff wouldn't give one. He told them that the claims in the dossier were basically bar talk, rumors, speculation, gossip, nothing he could verify, nothing he could confirm, just things he'd heard from people who'd heard from other people. The FBI learned this in January 2017. Bongino looked up from the document, his eyes boring into Schiff. You made your more than circumstantial evidence claim in March 2017. 2 months after the FBI learned that the primary source for the dossier couldn't verify any of it. 2 months after they knew it was garbage. And you, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, had access to that information. You either knew the dossier was nonsense and cited it anyway, or you failed in your most basic oversight duties. Which is it? Schiff's face had gone from pale to flushed. His hands, which had been folded calmly on the table, were now gripping the edge of it. The dossier was never the sole basis for. Then what was the basis? Bongino demanded, his voice rising for the first time to something approaching a shout. Give me one piece of actual evidence. Not contacts, not meetings, not some Trump campaign volunteer who once talked to someone who knew someone who was Russian. Actual evidence of criminal conspiracy. One piece. That's all I'm asking for. Just one. Silence. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Schiff's mouth opened, then closed. He looked down at his papers. He looked at his lawyer. He looked anywhere but at Bongino. You can't, can you? Bongino said quietly, his voice carrying perfectly in the silent room. You can't give me even one piece of evidence, because there never was any. It was always smoke and mirrors. It was always political. It was always about damaging Trump, not about protecting America. He opened another folder, and this one was even thicker than the first. Let's talk about the FISA warrants. The FBI applied for warrants to surveil Carter Page 4 times. 4 separate applications, each requiring judicial approval. And each time, they had to swear to the FISA court that the information they were presenting was verified and accurate. Each time, they cited the Steele dossier as a key piece of evidence. And each time, they failed to mention crucial facts. Bongino pulled out the Inspector General's report, the one that had devastated the FBI's credibility when it was finally released. The IG found 17 significant errors and omissions in those FISA applications. 17. These weren't typos, Congressman. These weren't accidental oversights. These were deliberate omissions of exculpatory evidence, evidence that would have undermined the warrant applications, evidence that might have caused the judge to deny the warrants. He found a specific page, one he'd tabbed and highlighted and probably memorized. For example, the FBI failed to tell the court that the Steele dossier was funded by the Clinton campaign. They failed to tell the court that Steele was desperate to prevent Trump from winning the election, his own words. They failed to tell the court that Steele's primary source couldn't verify any of the claims. They failed to tell the court that Carter Page had actually been working with the CIA, with our intelligence agencies, which explained the very contacts they were using as evidence of wrongdoing. Bongino's voice grew harder with each example. And in one case, an FBI lawyer named Kevin Kleinsmith literally altered an email to hide the fact that Carter Page had worked with the CIA. He changed the email from Page was a source to Page was not a source. He fabricated evidence, Congressman. He altered a document to deceive a federal judge. And for that, he got a slap on the wrist, probation, and a suspended law license that was eventually reinstated. He looked directly at Schiff now, and there was something in his eyes that went beyond anger. It was disappointment. The disappointment of someone who had believed in these institutions and watched them get corrupted. And when Devin Nunes tried to expose all of this, when he wrote his memo in February 2018 detailing the FISA abuse, the bias, the omissions, what did you do, Congressman? The question hung in the air. You attacked him. You went on every network that would have you. You called his memo misleading. You called it cherry-picked. You called it a threat to national security. You released your own memo defending the FBI, defending the process, defending everything that we now know was rotten to the core. Bongino slapped the table lightly, not in anger but for emphasis. But Nunes was right about everything. The Inspector General's report proved it. The Durham investigation proved it. Every single thing Nunes said in that memo was accurate. The FBI did abuse the FISA process. They did lie to the court. They did withhold exculpatory evidence. They did rely on political opposition research. Nunes was telling the truth. He paused, and you called him a liar. You questioned his patriotism. You suggested he was doing Russia's work by exposing FBI misconduct. You used your position as Intelligence Committee chairman to destroy his credibility. Bongino's voice dropped to something quieter, but somehow more devastating. Do you owe Devin Nunes an apology, Congressman? Schiff said nothing. His silence was its own answer. I'll take that as a no, Bongino said, because apologizing would require admitting you were wrong. And you've never admitted that, have you? Not about Russia, not about the dossier, not about the FISA abuse, not about Nunes, not about any of it. You just moved on to the next accusation, the next investigation, the next way to damage your political opponents. He gathered some papers, organizing them, and when he looked up again, his expression had changed. There was something new there. Not just anger or disappointment, but a kind of grim determination. But Russia was just the beginning, wasn't it, Congressman? Let's talk about October 2020. Let's talk about Hunter Biden's laptop. If Schiff had looked uncomfortable before, he looked genuinely ill now. This was more recent, more indefensible, harder to hide behind the complexities of intelligence work and classified briefings. October 14th, 2020, Bongino recited from memory, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had studied this timeline obsessively. The New York Post publishes a story about Hunter Biden's laptop, emails showing business dealings in China and Ukraine, evidence of the Biden family profiting from Joe Biden's position as vice president, compromising photos and videos. All of it authenticated by multiple sources, including the laptop repair shop owner and the metadata in the emails themselves. He pulled up another video clip on his tablet. October 19th, 2020. You go on CNN, and you say, "Let me get this exactly right," you say. "This smells like and has all the classic earmarks of Russian disinformation." He played the clip, Schiff's voice, confident and certain, declaring the laptop story to be Russian propaganda. "You had no evidence it was Russian disinformation," Bongino said when the clip ended. "You just asserted it. And the media, desperate for a reason to ignore the story, ran with it. Twitter banned the New York Post's account. Facebook throttled the story. Every major news organization either ignored it or parroted your claim that it was Russian disinformation." His voice grew harder, more accusatory. "But here's what you didn't tell the American people, Congressman. The FBI had that laptop since December 2019, almost a full year before the Post story. They'd authenticated it. They'd verified the emails. They knew it was real. They had extracted the data. They had everything. And they said nothing while you went on television and called it Russian disinformation." Bongino leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "In fact, let me tell you what else happened. On October 19th, the same day you went on CNN, 51 former intelligence officials signed a letter saying the laptop story had all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. You know who organized that letter?" He didn't wait for Schiff to answer. "Anthony Blinken from the Biden campaign, now Secretary of State. And you know who those officials were. Your allies, your friends in the intelligence community. People who had worked with you, who trusted you, who followed your lead." He pulled out the letter, waving it slightly. And this letter was used in the October 22nd presidential debate. Biden cited it directly. He said, 50 former intelligence officials have said this is Russian disinformation." He used it to dismiss the entire story, to avoid answering questions about his family's business dealings. The letter gave him cover, and the media gave him cover. And you, Congressman, you gave him cover. Bongino's voice rose again, the controlled anger breaking through. "But it wasn't disinformation. It was real. Every bit of it. The FBI knew it was real. You, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, either knew it was real or should have known. And yet you went on television and told America it was Russian disinformation. Why?" "I had information suggesting," Schiff began. "From whom?" Bongino demanded immediately. "Give me a name. Give me a source. What specific information did you have that suggested the laptop was fake? And why did that information override the fact that the FBI had authenticated it?" Schiff started to fall back on his standard defense. "I can't discuss classified." "It's not classified anymore." Bongino's patience snapped completely. "The IRS whistleblowers have testified. The FBI has confirmed the laptop's authenticity. The emails have been verified by multiple independent sources. Everything's public now. So I'm asking you, what information did you have?" Silence again, that damning silence. "You didn't have information, did you?" Bongino said, his voice dropping back to something quieter but more devastating. "You just knew the story was damaging to Joe Biden. You knew it might cost him the election. So you used your position, your committee chairmanship, your credibility as an intelligence expert to discredit it. You interfered in a presidential election with a lie." He pulled out polling data. spreadsheets of numbers that told a story more damning than any testimony. Post-election polls showed that 16% of Biden voters, 16%, said they wouldn't have voted for him if they'd known about the laptop, if they'd known about the business dealings, if they'd known about the evidence of the Biden family profiting from Joe's position. 16%. Bongino let that number hang in the air. The election was decided by 44,000 votes across 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. 44,000 votes. And you helped suppress a true story that polling suggests could have changed the outcome of a presidential election. His voice dropped to barely controlled fury. Congressman, I spent years protecting presidents. Republican and Democrat didn't matter to me. I took an oath. I put my life on the line. I believed in the institutions. I believed in the process. I believed that our intelligence agencies served America, not political parties. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something that sounded like grief in his voice. And you took that process and you corrupted it. You weaponized your position to help one candidate and hurt another. You used the credibility of the Intelligence Committee, the gravitas of national security concerns, to interfere in an election. That's not oversight, Congressman. That's not intelligence work. That's political warfare. That's using government power for partisan purposes. The Democratic members tried to object, tried to interrupt, but the Republican chairman gavelled them down. Mr. Bongino has the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Bongino said, taking a breath, collecting himself again. Because we're not done. Let's talk about your impeachments, both of them. He pulled out yet another transcript, and Schiff visibly braced himself. September 26, 2019. You're chairing a hearing on the Trump-Zelensky phone call, the call that would form the basis of the first impeachment. And you do something remarkable, something I've never seen a committee chairman do in my life. Bongino looked up from the transcript. You fabricate the contents of the call. You stand up in an official congressional hearing and you make up a conversation that never happened. You say Trump told Zelensky, and I quote what you said, "I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent. Understand? Lots of it." He looked up at Schiff. Except Trump never said that, not anything close to that. The transcript was released the same day. Anyone could read it. It was public. And what you said bore no resemblance to what was actually in the call. That was characterized as parody, Schiff protested weakly. Parody? Bongino repeated the word with utter disbelief. You were chairing an official congressional hearing. You were presenting what appeared to be evidence in an impeachment investigation. You used language like "in sum" and "character" before reading your fabricated version, making it sound like you were summarizing the actual call. Members of the public watching on C-SPAN believed it was real. And only when you got called out, only when people pointed out that you'd completely fabricated it, did you claim it was parody. He shook his head in disgust. Congressman, I've been in law enforcement. If a prosecutor did that in court, if they made up evidence and presented it as real, even as a summary, they'd be disbarred. They'd face sanctions. They might face criminal charges for suborning perjury or fabricating evidence. But you just claimed it was a joke and moved on. Bongino flipped through more papers, his movements sharp now, the controlled demeanor slipping into something closer to outrage. And during that first impeachment, you held closed-door depositions in the SCIF. Witnesses came in, testified in secret, and then mysteriously, details from those depositions leaked to the media. Always details that made Trump look bad. Always details that supported the impeachment narrative. Never the exculpatory parts. Never the context. He pulled out a report. Multiple witnesses complained about selective leaking, about testimony being taken out of context, about the public narrative not matching what they actually said. And when those same witnesses testified publicly, suddenly their stories didn't sound so damning. Suddenly there was context. Suddenly the case wasn't as clear-cut as the leaked snippets had suggested. Bongino looked at Schiff. You know who had access to those depositions. You, your committee, your staff. Those leaks came from somewhere, and they came from someone who wanted to shape the public narrative before the actual evidence was public. I never leaked, Schiff started. You were responsible for that committee, Bongino cut him off. If leaks were happening from your committee, and they absolutely were, you either authorized them, encouraged them, or failed to stop them. Either way, that's your responsibility. That's what a chairman does. That's what leadership means. He moved to the second impeachment without pausing. And then January 6th. You were one of the impeachment managers. You presented video evidence to the Senate, highly selective video evidence. You showed violence. You showed chaos. You showed the worst moments, and they were terrible moments, I'm not denying that. Bongino pulled out a timeline, detailed and specific. But you know what you didn't show? You didn't show Trump's actual speech where he explicitly said, "I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." You edited that part out. You also didn't mention that the FBI had confidential human sources in the crowd. You didn't mention that Capitol Police had intelligence about potential violence days in advance, but failed to prepare adequately. You didn't show any of the 14,000 hours of security footage that might have provided additional context. He looked at Schiff with something approaching contempt. You created a narrative. You crafted a story. You showed the jury, the United States Senate, only the evidence that supported your predetermined conclusion. You hid exculpatory evidence. You edited out context. You presented a partial picture designed to achieve a political outcome. His voice grew quieter but more intense. That's not justice, Congressman. That's propaganda. That's show trial tactics. That's what happens in authoritarian countries, not in America. The president incited an insurrection, Schiff began, but Bongino was ready. Then why didn't you show all the evidence? He challenged. Why not show everything, the full speech, the full timeline, the full context, and let the Senate decide? Why selectively edit? Why hide evidence that might help Trump's defense? Unless... He paused for effect. Unless you knew that showing all the evidence would undermine your case. Unless you knew that the full context wouldn't support the narrative you were selling. Unless you knew that a fair presentation of the facts wouldn't get you the outcome you wanted. Bongino stood up, gathering his materials with deliberate slowness. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Less angry now, more sad, more disappointed. "Congressman Schiff, I'm going to tell you what I see when I look at your record. I see a pattern. A clear, unmistakable pattern that goes back to 2016 and continues to this day." He began counting off on his fingers. You pushed the Russia collusion hoax for 2 years, claiming to have evidence you never produced. You defended the FBI's abuse of the FISA process and attacked those who tried to expose it. You called the Hunter Biden laptop Russian disinformation when you knew, or should have known, it was real. You fabricated evidence in an impeachment hearing and called it parody when you got caught. You selectively leaked classified information to shape public narratives. You hid exculpatory evidence in impeachment proceedings. You used your security clearance and your committee access to damage your political opponents and protect your political allies. His voice grew more passionate with each point. And you know what the worst part is? You did all of this while wrapping yourself in the flag of national security. "I can't reveal classified information," you'd say. "I'm protecting America," you'd claim. But you weren't protecting America, Congressman. You were protecting your party. You were protecting your power. You were using national security as a shield for partisan warfare. Bongino pulled out one final document, and this one seemed to carry more weight than all the others. This is a letter signed by 53 current and former FBI agents. 53. They wrote this letter saying they were horrified by the weaponization of the Bureau. They watched their agency, an agency they loved, an agency they dedicated their lives to, get used as a political weapon. They watched investigations get opened for political purposes. They watched evidence get manufactured. They watched exculpatory evidence get suppressed. His voice caught slightly, and for the first time, genuine emotion broke through. "I know some of these people, Congressman. I worked with people like them. Good people, honorable people, people who believed in the mission. People who put on that badge every day thinking they were serving something bigger than themselves. And you know what you did to them? You tarnished their service. You made Americans distrust the FBI. You made people question whether our intelligence agencies can be trusted. You turned patriots into objects of suspicion. He looked directly at Schiff, and there was pain in his eyes now. That's your legacy, Congressman. Not protecting America, not providing oversight, not keeping us safe. Your legacy is destroying trust in the institutions that are supposed to protect us. Bongino took a breath, steadying himself. My grandfather was NYPD. My father was NYPD. I was NYPD and then Secret Service. My family has generations of service. We believed in these institutions. We put our lives on the line for them. We took oaths. We meant those oaths. His voice hardened again. And you corrupted them. You weaponized them. You turned them into tools of political warfare. You made people like me, people who dedicated their lives to public service. You made us question everything we believed in. The room was absolutely silent. Even the Democratic members weren't trying to interrupt anymore. Some of them were looking down at their papers. Some were looking anywhere but at Schiff or Bongino. So here's what I'm calling for, Bongino continued, his voice stronger now, more certain. I'm calling for your censure by this House. I'm calling for your removal from any committee dealing with intelligence or law enforcement. I'm calling for a full investigation into your potential violations of House rules regarding the handling of classified information, the unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information, and the abuse of your committee position. He leaned on the table, his eyes never leaving Schiff's face. And most importantly, I'm calling for you to finally tell the truth to the American people. Admit that there was no evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. Admit that you lied when you said you'd seen such evidence. Admit that the Steele dossier was political opposition research, and you knew it. Admit that you were wrong about the Hunter Biden laptop. Admit that you selectively leaked information and selectively presented evidence in both impeachments. Just tell the truth, Congressman. Just admit what you did. Bongino straightened up, his expression a mixture of hope and certainty. But you won't, will you? Because telling the truth would require acknowledging what you really are. Not a patriot protecting America. Not an intelligence expert serving the country. But a partisan operative who used every tool at his disposal, including our most sacred intelligence agencies and our national security apparatus, to destroy your political enemies and advance your political interests. He gathered his papers one final time. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. I think the American people can draw their own conclusions. The room erupted. Republicans were on their feet, some applauding. Democrats were shouting objections. Reporters were sprinting for the exits, desperate to be the first to file their stories. Camera operators were zooming in on Schiff's face, capturing that moment of total defeat. And Adam Schiff sat at the witness table, his carefully constructed mask of concern finally and completely shattered. For just a moment, before he could rebuild his composure, everyone in that room saw what was underneath: fear, anger, and something that looked very much like the realization that everything was about to come crashing down. The chairman had to gavel the room to order 6 times. The banging echoed through the chamber, mixing with the shouting, the movement, the chaos of a moment that everyone knew would be remembered for years. When order was finally, barely, restored, the chairman leaned into his microphone. His voice was formal, procedural, but there was an undercurrent of satisfaction that he couldn't quite hide. Congressman Schiff, do you wish to respond to Mr. Bongino's statements? Schiff cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, less certain. The armor had been dented. I stand by my actions. Everything I did was in good faith, based on the best information available at the time. The threats to our democracy were real. The concerns about foreign interference were legitimate. I would do it again. The words sounded hollow even as he said them. Rehearsed, defensive, desperate. That's the problem, Bongino said quietly from his seat, his microphone still live. You would do it again, because you've never faced consequences, because people like you never do. And with that, he stood, nodded respectfully to the chairman, gathered his materials, and walked out of the hearing room. Behind him, chaos erupted again. Democrats were demanding recognition, shouting about partisan witch hunts and Republican overreach. Republicans were calling for votes on censure, on committee removal, on investigations. Reporters were filing updates in real time, their phones lighting up with editor demands for every detail. But Dan Bongino didn't look back. He'd said what he came to say. He'd done what he'd waited years to do. He'd held Adam Schiff accountable, on camera, under oath, with nowhere to hide. The video clips hit social media within seconds. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, every platform exploded with the confrontation. Bongino destroys Schiff became the #1 trending topic on Twitter within 30 minutes. By the 1-hour mark, the hashtag had over 2 million tweets. By evening, the full hearing had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. By the next morning, that number would pass 150 million. Conservative media was jubilant. Fox News cleared its entire primetime schedule to run segments on the hearing. Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, Laura and Graham all led with it. The clips played on loop, each host providing their own analysis, their own context, their own celebration of what they were calling a historic moment of accountability. Talk radio exploded. Rush Limbaugh's replacement, Mark Levin, The Clay Travis and Buck Sexton Show, they all played audio clips on repeat. Callers couldn't stop talking about it. The phone lines were jammed with people wanting to share their reactions, their vindication, their hope that maybe, finally, someone in power would face consequences. The Daily Wire ran a 3-hour emergency podcast. Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, and Andrew Klavan all weighed in, dissecting every moment, every question, every time Schiff failed to answer. Their video got 20 million views in the first 12 hours. Newsmax and One America News ran wall-to-wall coverage. Their ratings for the day shattered records. America wanted to see this. America had been waiting for this. Even some mainstream outlets, unable to ignore the massive viewership numbers and the sheer volume of social media activity, had to cover it, though their coverage was more muted, more defensive, more focused on Republican overreach than on Schiff's failure to answer basic questions. The New York Post's headline the next morning, "Receipts, Bongino brings the evidence Schiff never had." The cover image was a freeze frame from the hearing, Bongino leaning forward, Schiff unable to meet his eyes. The Washington Times, former Secret Service agent exposes Schiff's Russia hoax lies under oath. Even the Washington Post had to run a story, though they framed it as Republican hearing targets Schiff over past Russia statements. But buried in the article, because they had to, was a fact check that acknowledged many of Bongino's specific claims about the timeline, the dossier funding, and the Mueller report findings were accurate. Within 48 hours, House Republicans introduced a resolution to censure Adam Schiff. The resolution was detailed, spanning multiple pages, itemizing specific claims and specific lies. It cited his repeated false claims about having evidence of Russian collusion, his role in promoting and defending the Steele dossier, while knowing it was opposition research, his attacks on Devin Nunes for exposing FISA abuse that was later proven to be real, his role in suppressing the Hunter Biden laptop story by falsely claiming it was Russian disinformation, his fabrication of the Trump-Zelensky call contents during the first impeachment, his selective presentation of evidence during both impeachment proceedings, potential violations of House rules regarding the handling and disclosure of classified information. Democrats tried to rally around Schiff. Nancy Pelosi issued a statement calling the censure a partisan attack on a dedicated public servant. Chuck Schumer called it Republican revenge politics. The Democratic caucus released talking points defending Schiff's record. But it was harder this time, much harder. The video was too damning. Bongino's questions were too specific, too documented, too backed up by official reports that couldn't be dismissed as partisan. The Mueller report couldn't be spun away. It said what it said. The Durham report couldn't be ignored anymore. The Inspector General's findings about FISA abuse were official government documents, not partisan conspiracy theories. And most importantly, Schiff's own silence in the face of direct questions spoke louder than any Democratic defense. The freeze frame of him unable to answer where his evidence was, that image was everywhere. It became a meme, a symbol, a representation of years of lies finally meeting reality. Polls showed that 68% of Americans had seen at least some clips from the hearing. Among those who watched, 54% believed Schiff had misled the public about Russian collusion. Even among Democrats, the numbers were damaging. 31% said they believed Schiff had overstated his evidence. Moderate Democrats in swing districts started doing their own calculations. They'd won their seats by narrow margins. Many of them had run as moderates, as reasonable voices, as people who could work across the aisle. Being seen defending Adam Schiff's demonstrable lies wasn't good politics in their districts. The censure vote was scheduled for the following week. Political analysts initially predicted it would fail along party lines, or pass by only 1 or 2 votes with some Republicans voting present. But as the week progressed, the dynamics shifted. 3 Democratic representatives from competitive districts announced they couldn't defend Schiff's statements about having evidence he clearly didn't have. 2 more said they needed to examine the record before deciding. That was political speak for "I'm probably voting yes, but I want to see which way the wind is blowing first." Behind closed doors, Democratic leadership was furious. They tried to pressure the potential defectors. They reminded them about party loyalty, about campaign funding, about committee assignments. But the representatives from swing districts had their own pressures. Voters who were asking why they would defend someone who appeared to have lied for years about having evidence of treason. By the day of the vote, 5 Democratic representatives had publicly stated they would vote for censure. Another 3 were undecided, which usually meant yes, but afraid to say it publicly. The vote took place on a Wednesday afternoon. The gallery was packed. CSBAN's ratings were the highest they'd been since January 6th. News networks broke into regular programming for live coverage. The final tally, 219 to 212. 5 Democrats joined all Republicans in censuring Adam Schiff. It was the first censure of a House member in over a decade, and only the second time in modern history that a member had been censured for conduct unrelated to personal corruption or criminal acts. The resolution included the removal of Schiff from the House Intelligence Committee. It was a crushing blow. The Intelligence Committee had been his platform, his source of power, his way of staying relevant and influential. Without access to classified briefings, without the ability to claim special knowledge, without the gravitas that came with the chairmanship, Schiff's influence would evaporate. The resolution also referred his conduct to the House Ethics Committee for further investigation, specifically regarding potential unauthorized disclosures of classified information. While the Ethics Committee was notoriously slow and rarely took serious action, the referral itself was damaging. It would hang over Schiff's head for months, maybe years. Within 2 weeks, the Department of Justice announced that it was reviewing potential unauthorized disclosures of classified information from the House Intelligence Committee during Schiff's chairmanship. The announcement was carefully worded. They wouldn't confirm that Schiff was the target. They wouldn't discuss the scope of the investigation. They wouldn't provide a timeline. But everyone knew who they were looking at. Everyone knew what they were investigating. The selective leaks to media during the Russia investigation. The classified information that had somehow made its way into news reports. The closed-door testimony that had been previewed in the press before it became public. The California political landscape shifted dramatically. Schiff had been running for Senate, positioning himself as the natural successor to Dianne Feinstein's seat. He'd been the favorite. He had name recognition, a massive fundraising apparatus, and the support of the California Democratic establishment. But post-hearing polls showed a dramatic shift. His favorability ratings, which had been strong among Democrats and dismal among Republicans, started to soften even among his base. In a head-to-head matchup against his Republican opponent, he went from leading by 8 points to trailing by 2 points. In California, a state that hadn't elected a Republican to statewide office in years. Even more concerning for Democrats, a credible primary challenger emerged. A moderate Democratic congresswoman from Orange County announced she was entering the race. Her first campaign ad featured clips from the Bongino hearing, Schiff unable to answer, Schiff looking down, Schiff silent, and ended with a simple question. Can we trust Adam Schiff to tell us the truth? The ad went viral. Within days, it had 15 million views. The challenger's fundraising numbers surged. Suddenly, Schiff had a real fight on his hands, not just in the general election but in the Democratic primary. National Democratic leaders found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't vigorously defend Schiff without appearing to defend lies about Russia and the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story. Both issues resonated with voters, including many Democrats who felt betrayed by the media's handling of these stories. But they also couldn't completely abandon Schiff without fracturing their base. Progressives still saw him as a hero of the resistance, someone who had stood up to Trump when others wouldn't. Abandoning him would look like surrender to Republican pressure. So they chose mostly silence. When asked about Schiff, they changed the subject. When pressed, they gave vague statements about supporting all Democratic candidates. It was abandonment by another name, and everyone in politics knew it. Schiff's media appearances dried up almost overnight. CNN, which had hosted him hundreds of times during the Trump years, sometimes multiple times per week, suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Producers who used to call his office begging for appearances stopped calling. When his staff reached out to pitch segments, they got polite deflections about the schedule being full. MSNBC, which had made him a regular fixture on Rachel Maddow, Joy Reid, and Lawrence O'Donnell, found other guests. Former intelligence officials who would toe the party line without the baggage of the Bongino confrontation following them everywhere. The major broadcast networks stopped calling entirely. The Sunday shows, which had once featured him regularly as a Democrat who could be counted on for strong anti-Trump soundbites, moved on to other voices. His book deal, a memoir that was supposed to be released the following year, tentatively titled Truth Matters, Defending Democracy in the Age of Disinformation, was quietly put on indefinite hold by his publisher. They cited shifting market conditions and scheduling challenges, but everyone knew what it really meant. They didn't want to publish a book about truth from someone who'd just been exposed for years of lies. Speaking engagement fees, which had been substantial during his time as the face of the anti-Trump resistance, dropped dramatically. Organizations that had been willing to pay $50,000 for a Schiff appearance were now offering $15,000, then $10,000, then nothing at all. The venues got smaller. The audiences got older and more partisan. The gravy train stopped. By the one-month mark, Adam Schiff had gone from being one of the most prominent Democrats in America, a fixture on cable news, a sought-after speaker, a hero of the resistance, to a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when partisan warfare is pursued without regard for truth. Squad members who had once praised his leadership during the Trump years distanced themselves. When asked about him, they pivoted to talking about their own priorities, their own legislative agendas. AOC, asked directly if she still supported Schiff's Senate run, gave a rambling answer about supporting progressives generally without mentioning his name. Nancy Pelosi, asked about Schiff at a press conference, gave a terse no comment and moved to the next question. Chuck Schumer, asked if he'd support Schiff's Senate campaign, said he was focused on other races right now and wouldn't be drawn into discussing specific candidates. The message was clear: Schiff was on his own. The investigations continued to multiply. The Durham investigation, which had largely concluded its work, was asked to provide all documents related to Schiff's public statements to the House Ethics Committee. The FBI whistleblowers who testified about the Hunter Biden laptop suppression were specifically asked about Schiff's role, about what he might have known and when he knew it. IRS investigators looking into the Biden family finances, investigations that had been suppressed during the Biden administration but were now active again, were asked to provide any communications with or about Schiff. Had he tried to influence their investigation? Had he been briefed on their findings? Had he shared information with the media or with the Biden campaign? Most significantly, the special counsel appointed to investigate the handling of classified documents expanded their scope to include potential unauthorized disclosures from congressional committees. While they couldn't say so publicly, everyone understood what that meant. They were looking at Schiff's leaks. Public trust in institutions, which Schiff had helped destroy with his partisan manipulation of intelligence, didn't magically return. Years of lies don't disappear because of one hearing, no matter how devastating. The damage was done. Americans' faith in the FBI, in the intelligence community, in congressional oversight, all of it had been shattered. But there was something else happening, something more subtle but perhaps more important. There was a growing sense among Americans that accountability was possible, that lies could be exposed, that even powerful committee chairmen could face consequences. That truth mattered, even in politics. It wasn't naive optimism. It wasn't everything will be fine wishful thinking. But it was something, a crack in the cynicism, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, the system could still work if enough people demanded it. Dan Bongino, meanwhile, saw his own profile skyrocket. His podcast, which had already been successful, became the #1 political podcast in America. Episodes about the Schiff confrontation were downloaded over 50 million times. His regular episodes were now routinely hitting the top 10 on Apple Podcasts. His radio show expanded to new markets. Stations that had been hesitant to carry his program suddenly wanted in. His audience grew from 3 million to 8 million to 12 million listeners per week. Publishers fought over his next book. The advance offers were staggering, 7 figures, 8 figures, bidding wars between major houses. Everyone wanted the Dan Bongino story. Everyone wanted his take on the weaponization of federal agencies. Everyone wanted to know what came next. But more importantly, he became the go-to expert on FBI and intelligence community issues. When news broke about anything related to federal law enforcement, FISA surveillance, or intelligence abuses, producers called Bongino first. His credibility, built on years of actual service, burnished by his confrontation with Schiff, was unassailable. He became a symbol of something many Americans had been craving, someone who would confront the lies directly, someone who had the credibility and knowledge to back it up, someone who wouldn't back down when accused of partisanship or conspiracy theories. Someone who had the receipts. The Bongino-Schiff confrontation, as it became known in political circles, changed the landscape of congressional oversight. It demonstrated that expert witnesses with actual law enforcement backgrounds couldn't be as easily dismissed or spun as partisan politicians making accusations. Other former FBI agents and intelligence officers, seeing what Bongino had done, began speaking out more freely. They'd been afraid before, afraid of retaliation, afraid of losing security clearances, afraid of being blackballed in the intelligence community. But Bongino had shown them it was possible to speak truth to power and survive. More than survive, to be vindicated. A group of former agents, inspired by Bongino's testimony, formed an organization dedicated to exposing politicization within the FBI and intelligence agencies. They called themselves Patriots for Constitutional Justice, and their membership grew rapidly. Within 3 months, they had over 200 current and former agents as members. They started providing testimony to Congress. They shared their stories with journalists who would listen. They documented cases of political pressure, of investigations opened for partisan reasons, of evidence suppressed or manufactured. The protective wall that had shielded the intelligence community from scrutiny began to crack. Congress began reforming FISA procedures. The Schiff confrontation had made FISA abuse a mainstream issue that couldn't be ignored anymore. Republicans and a handful of moderate Democrats worked together on legislation that would require disclosure to the FISA court when evidence came from political opposition research, mandate the inclusion of exculpatory evidence in warrant applications, create an amicus system where defense perspectives could be presented in FISA proceedings, impose serious penalties on any official who knowingly omitted material facts from a FISA application. The FBI director, facing pressure from Congress and from agents within his own organization, issued new guidance on political investigations. Investigations touching on political campaigns or elected officials would require approval from headquarters. Multiple layers of review would be mandatory. Political affiliation couldn't be the basis for opening an investigation. The Durham Report's findings, which had been largely dismissed by mainstream media when first released, suddenly received renewed attention. Journalists who'd ignored it or written it off as partisan started actually reading it, and they found exactly what Bongino had said. The Russia investigation had been built on a foundation of lies, maintained through abuses of power, and protected by people who had every incentive to keep the hoax alive. The media landscape shifted, too. After being forced to cover the Bongino Schiff hearing despite their reluctance, forced by the sheer volume of public interest and social media activity, mainstream outlets became slightly more willing to report critically on intelligence community abuses. The protective bubble around intelligence experts like Schiff had been popped. Reporters started asking harder questions. They started demanding evidence instead of accepting assertions. They started treating intelligence officials' claims with appropriate skepticism rather than reflexive deference. Conservative candidates across the country began using the Schiff confrontation in their campaigns. Will you hold people like Adam Schiff accountable? Became a standard debate question. Do you believe politicians should face consequences when they lie about evidence they don't have? Democratic candidates had to answer, had to choose between defending Schiff and maintaining credibility with moderate voters. Most chose credibility. They'd say things like, "I believe in truth and accountability," without mentioning Schiff by name, or "everyone should be held to the same standard," while carefully avoiding any defense of his specific conduct. It was political cowardice dressed up as principle, but it marked a shift. Even Democrats couldn't openly defend Schiff's lies anymore. Most significantly, the hearing marked a turning point in how Americans thought about the Russia investigation. For years, it had been a partisan dispute. Democrats insisted it was legitimate and necessary. Republicans called it a hoax and a witch hunt. The public was divided, unsure who to believe. But Bongino's systematic dismantling of Schiff's claims, backed by declassified documents, Inspector General reports, and the Mueller report itself, provided clarity. It wasn't a partisan dispute anymore. It was a documented case of intelligence community abuse and political lies. The talking points that had worked for years stopped working. Mueller documented numerous contacts. Didn't matter when Mueller himself said there was no conspiracy. The investigation was warranted, didn't address Schiff's lies about having evidence. Trump obstructed justice, didn't explain the FISA abuse or the Steele dossier deception. 3 months after the hearing, Dan Bongino sat in his podcast studio in Florida, preparing for another show. The studio was modest. He'd always been more focused on content than flash, but professional. Quality microphone, good acoustics, a simple backdrop. On the wall behind him, framed but not ostentatious, was a photo from his Secret Service days. A class photo of young agents, himself among them, all in their suits, all looking serious and dedicated, all believing they were joining something noble, something that served the country, not a party. His producer knocked on the glass partition. "You've got a call. It's one of the FBI whistleblowers from the Hunter laptop case. Says he wants to thank you." Bongino picked up the phone. The conversation was brief but meaningful. The agent, still active duty, still anonymous for his protection, told him that the testimony had given others courage to come forward, that more whistleblowers were preparing to testify, that the truth was finally, slowly coming out. "You showed us it was possible," the agent said. "You showed us that speaking up doesn't mean the end of everything, that there's life after telling the truth." When Bongino hung up, he sat quietly for a moment, looking at that photo on the wall. Those young agents who believed in something bigger than themselves. He wondered how many of them had become disillusioned over the years, how many had watched their agency get corrupted and felt powerless to stop it, how many had stayed silent because they didn't know what else to do. Then he picked up another photo from his desk, one that wasn't framed, just sitting there. It was a screenshot from the hearing, captured by a C-SPAN camera at the perfect moment. The exact moment when Schiff realized he couldn't answer the question about evidence. Schiff's face showed something rarely seen from the usually composed congressman: fear. Not anger, not defiance. Fear. The fear of someone who'd been lying for years and finally got caught. The fear of someone who realized in that moment that everything was about to change. Bongino didn't keep the photo as a trophy. He wasn't that kind of person. He kept it as a reminder that truth matters, that lies have consequences, that accountability is possible even for the powerful. He set the photo down and turned to his microphone. He had a show to do, stories to tell, truth to speak. The work wasn't done, it was never done, but today's work had meaning. Across the country, in a much smaller office in Burbank, Adam Schiff sat with his dwindling staff. His campaign manager was showing him the latest polling numbers. His Senate race, which should have been a coronation, was now a real fight. He was trailing in both the primary and the general election polls. "We need to go on offense," his campaign manager said. "Frame this as Republican attacks, make yourself the victim, rally the base." Schiff shook his head slowly. He'd tried that. It wasn't working anymore. Every time he claimed he was being attacked unfairly, someone posted the clip. Bongino asking for evidence. Schiff unable to provide it. That 5-second silence that said everything. "Where's your evidence?" Those 3 words echoed in his head constantly now. He heard them when he tried to sleep. He heard them when he prepared for speeches. He heard them in every interview, every debate, every public appearance. He'd never answered that question, and now it was too late. His press secretary knocked on the door. "CNN wants to book you for a segment on voting rights. They're asking if you're available next week." Finally, Schiff thought. A friendly interview. A chance to talk about something else. A chance to remind people why they'd supported him in the first place. "What show?" he asked. "Anderson Cooper 360. Schiff nodded. "Tell them yes." The press secretary hesitated. "There's one thing," they said. "They want to ask about the hearing, about the testimony, about the evidence claims." Of course they did. Everyone wanted to ask about that. It was all anyone wanted to talk about anymore. "Tell them no," Schiff said quietly. After the press secretary left, Schiff sat alone in his office. The walls were covered with photos from his career, meeting presidents, chairing important hearings, standing with party leaders, evidence of a successful political career, of influence and power and respect. But now, when he looked at those photos, all he could see was that moment. Bongino asking the question, the silence stretching out, the realization that he had no answer, that he'd never had an answer, that everything was built on sand. History would remember the confrontation through one particular moment, endlessly replayed across every platform. It came after Bongino asked Schiff to provide the evidence he'd claimed to have seen for 2 years. The camera caught both of them in a 2-shot. Bongino leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, expression somewhere between disappointment and disgust. Not angry. Anger implies surprise, implies emotion overtaking reason. This was something colder. This was the look of someone who knew exactly what was happening, who'd planned for this moment, who was simply watching it unfold exactly as expected. And Schiff, mouth opening and closing, shuffling papers with hands that weren't quite steady, looking down at documents that contained no answers, looking at his lawyer who could do nothing to help him, looking anywhere but at Bongino, looking anywhere but at the cameras. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds, an eternity on television, an eternity in politics. 5 seconds where everyone watching realized that there was no answer coming. 5 seconds that said more than any words could. Finally, Schiff said something about classified information and ongoing matters, the standard deflection, the reliable escape hatch. But this time, it sounded hollow even to him, because Bongino had already closed that door, had already pointed out that everything was declassified now, that there were no ongoing matters, that there was nowhere to hide. That moment became iconic. It appeared in political science textbooks as an example of accountability in oversight hearings. It was used in journalism ethics courses as a case study in the importance of follow-up questions. It was referenced in debates about intelligence community reform and congressional oversight. Conservative groups used freeze frames from that moment with various captions. When the lies catch up, the sound of accountability, 5 seconds of truth. But perhaps the most powerful use came from a grassroots organization that made a simple video. It showed that 5-second silence, Schiff unable to answer, the camera capturing every uncomfortable moment. Then it cut to families whose lives had been destroyed by the Russia investigation. Carter Page, talking about losing his job, his reputation, his life savings defending himself against accusations that were based on lies. Michael Flynn, a decorated general, bankrupted by legal fees, prosecuted for a process crime, watching his life service to the country end in disgrace based on an investigation built on manufactured evidence. Countless others caught in the machinery of a politically motivated investigation. FBI agents who'd questioned what was happening but were told to stay quiet. Intelligence analysts who'd raised concerns about the Steele dossier but were ignored. Media figures who'd built their careers on the Russia story and had to reckon with promoting something that wasn't true. The video ended with a simple question in white text on a black background. Was it worth it? Then one final message. This is what accountability looks like. Because that's what it was. Not some distant future where karma eventually catches up. Not in the next election cycle where voters might or might not remember, but right there, in real time, on camera, under oath. Dan Bongino didn't just ask questions. He demanded answers. He brought receipts, not vague accusations or partisan talking points, but specific documents, official reports, declassified briefings, video clips, transcripts. He used his credibility as a former federal agent, someone who'd served inside these institutions, to force a reckoning that politicians had avoided for years. And Adam Schiff, who'd spent years hiding behind classified information, behind committee chairmanship, behind partisan protection and friendly media coverage, Schiff finally had to face the music, finally had to answer for the lies, finally had to sit there on camera and admit through his silence that he'd never had the evidence he claimed to have. Now let me ask you something. 4 critical questions that every American needs to consider. 1. Should there be criminal charges for politicians who lie about classified information, who use their security clearances and their committee positions to make accusations they know aren't true, who weaponize national security concerns for partisan purposes? 2. Should Adam Schiff be permanently banned from holding any intelligence-related position? Should someone who demonstrably abused his access to classified information, who leaked selectively, who lied repeatedly about what he knew, should that person ever be trusted with such responsibility again? 3. Will we ever get the full truth about the Russia investigation's origins? About who knew what and when? About how a piece of opposition research became the basis for surveilling an American political campaign? About why no one faced serious consequences for the lies and abuses? 4. What other politicians need to face this kind of questioning? Who else has used their position to mislead the American people? Who else has hidden behind classified information while making accusations they couldn't prove? Who else needs to be put under oath and asked, "Where's your evidence?" Share this if you believe truth matters more than party. If you believe politicians must face consequences for lies. If you believe intelligence agencies shouldn't be weaponized for partisan purposes. If you believe Dan Bongino spoke for millions of Americans who have been demanding accountability for years. Because this wasn't just about one hearing. It wasn't just about one congressman getting caught in his lies. It was about years of deception finally meeting reality. It was about Americans who'd been called conspiracy theorists finally being vindicated. It was about institutions corrupted by politics finally facing consequences, however small, however inadequate.